وأرجو الإحسان والإحسان.
Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast here on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamima. These are today's top stories. Turkey readies for its first cross-party rally to condemn the bloody coup attempt against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. At least 14 people are killed in Iraq as a bomber blows himself up at a police checkpoint in Baghdad's district of Kadhimiya. And Syrian government airstrikes hit 4 hospitals on a local blood bank in Aleppo. Turkey was readying for its first cross-party rally to condemn the bloody coup attempt against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as his government pressed on with a purge of suspected state enemies. The mass pro-democracy rally, to be held under tight security on Istanbul's iconic Taksim Square, was called by the biggest opposition group, the secular and center-left Republican People's Party. But to signal patriotic unity, it will be joined by Erdogan's Islamic conservative AKP, whose followers have turned city squares red with seas of Turkish flags every night since the failed coup. In fact, Prime Minister Binali Yildirim said the Turkish Republic is stronger than it was in the past and has vowed that anti-democratic elements will be erased. Also targeted in the sweep was an alleged senior aide to U.S.-based cleric Fethullah Gulen, a reclusive spiritual leader whom Turkey accuses of having orchestrated the plot to overthrow Erdogan. A suicide bomber has detonated an explosive vest near a security checkpoint in northwest Baghdad. Iraqi officials said an attacker on foot blew himself up this morning at one of the entrances to the Shia district of Kadhimiya, killing at least 10 civilians and 4 policemen. Another 31 other people were wounded. Sources at Kadhimiya Hospital, where victims of the blast were taken, said the death toll could rise as some of the wounded were in critical condition. Elsewhere in the country, 3 more civilians were killed and 11 wounded in a bomb explosion in an outdoor market in Baghdad's western suburb of Abu Ghraib. Now for some news in Lebanon. Maronite Patriarch Shadadahi has called on the country's politicians to reach a political settlement aimed at ending Lebanon's ongoing presidential vacuum. During a pastoral visit to the town of Araya, Rahi warned of a rampant amount of corruption and a major paralysis and said Lebanon has reached a tipping point. The Patriarch also called on the international community to separate the presidential crisis from the regional developments while urging the Lebanese to take a firm decision in order to resolve the issue. The Lebanese army has arrested one of Nusrat Front's top officials in an ambush in the northeastern border town of Arsal. A security source said the unidentified militant, who worked as a logistics coordinator for the group between Arsal proper and its outskirts, was arrested at dawn in the rugged Wadi Hamayid area along the Lebanese-Syrian border. No further details about the arrest were given. 4 alleged militants who belong to what is considered a terrorist group by the Lebanese government have decided to hand themselves over to Lebanese authorities. A security source says Baha al-Bernawi and Mahmoud al-Karut, both Lebanese nationals, who had been hiding in the South Lebanon Palestinian refugee camp of Ain al-Helwe, handed themselves over to military intelligence. 2 other Lebanese nationals, Mohammed Shmandar and Yahya al-Or, also turned themselves in to the joint Palestinian security forces in the camp, who will transfer them to the army after questioning. Shmandar is no other than the brother of former Lebanese singer Fadel Shakir. All 4 are affiliated to Jund al-Sham and the detained radical preacher Ahmed al-Asir. Moving on to Syria, government airstrikes have put 4 makeshift hospitals and a local blood bank in Aleppo out of action in the past 24 hours, jeopardizing medical care for more than 200,000 desperate civilians in rebel-held areas. The bombardment since Saturday has worsened the plight of residents of besieged eastern neighborhoods of Syria's second city, where food and medical supplies are becoming increasingly scarce. Among those killed was a 2-day-old baby in a children's hospital in a besieged eastern neighborhood of Aleppo. A spokesman for a volunteer rescue group known as White Helmets says the 5 medical facilities hit overnight are currently out of service. Afghanistan is observing a national day of mourning after a twin suicide bombing at a protest march in Kabul killed 80 people and wounded another 230. Families collected bodies from hospitals and morgues in preparation for funerals in the west of the capital. Several families are still searching for missing relatives. Southeast Asian foreign ministers will hold crunch talks in Laos at a summit already overshadowed by infighting over Beijing's saber rattling in the South China Sea. The gathering in Vientiane is the first major regional talks since the UN-backed tribunal ruled earlier this month that China did not have historic rights to vast swathes of the strategic area. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who arrives in Laos on Monday, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi are among the delegates attending meetings on the sidelines of the summit. The 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, known as ASEAN, has long presented itself as the best place for China to negotiate with neighbors over disputes. Beijing has resisted that approach, insisting that territorial disputes must be settled bilaterally. In recent years, ASEAN has struggled to present a united front against China, with allegations that the regional superpower has forged alliances with smaller countries like Laos and Cambodia through aid and loans. Moving on to the United States, a fast-moving wildfire has burned through nearly 90 square kilometers of land, prompting hundreds of people to flee from their homes northwest of Los Angeles. The so-called Sand Fire broke out on Friday in the Sand Canyon area of suburban Santa Clarita, triggering mandatory evacuation orders. The wildfire threatened at least 1,500 homes, an animal sanctuary, and around 100 commercial structures. Winds pushed the blaze into the adjacent Angeles National Forest, and it rapidly gained ground within hours in the hot weather and drought conditions. Coming up next, part 2 of Yumna Naufal's interview with political commentator Tariq Osman. Stay with us. Welcome back. Yumna Naufal sat down to discuss with political commentator Tariq Osman the attacks in Europe and the impact of the Syrian war on the Middle East and the world. Here's part 2 of the interview.
You speak of religion, and I want to talk a little bit about Turkey, because Turkey for a long time was seen as somewhat of a successful country in terms of having a big majority of Muslims and being a successful democracy, having the socio-economics of it work as well. A day after the Nice attacks, an attempted coup in Turkey, largely considered to be a successful examples of a democratic country, failed. And a lot of analysts said that with the failure of this coup, democracy also took a hit. Do you believe that?
In my opinion, it's too early at this stage to reflect on what exactly happened during that attempt and the responses after that. And I mean, you know me, I'm not the kind of guy who usually jumps and to conclusions a week after. But for me, the most important point is regarding Turkey is the first sentence you mentioned, that Turkey has had now for the past roughly 15 years a government that by any standards has political Islam as some sort of a frame of reference, at least one version of political Islam as a frame of reference. But the interesting thing about Turkey is that for the 80 years before that, the foundations of the Turkish Republic were different, were the idea of secularism, the Kemal Atatürk model, imposed from the top and supposedly accepted by the vast majority of Turks. Yet, in the past 15 years, we're seeing a majority, certainly, that has opted for a different type of model. The interesting thing about Turkey, I think, is whether in the next 10 years we'll see some sort of evolution in which the two will meet each other, or we will continue to see that polarization widening. For me, that's the really important point about Turkey, and that will be the real test of Turkish democracy.
When speaking of Turkey, we cannot but speak of its porous border with Syria and the fact that that border has dealt Turkey a massive blow, because in the last year alone they've had bombings in Ankara, in Istanbul, the protests. I mean, they don't have to necessarily be mutually exclusive or inclusive, but we can't talk about Turkey without talking about Syria and the fact that right now all countries that are neighboring Syria are being affected by what's happening there. And what's happening there, and we were discussing this before the interview, is that according to you and to what's happening, ISIS has claimed large parts of Syria and Iraq and is basically dominating there right now and starting to transcend the borders. Right.
You touched on what I think is the really important point about ISIS, and that's different slightly from Syria, but to my mind, it's the very first time in at least 100 years in which you have a militant Islamist group that has captured a piece of land, not on the margins of the Islamic world, but at the center of it, and is able to control that piece of land and effectively have some sort of a government there, control some resources, have revenue streams. And that is happening at the exact moment in which the two largest states in that part of the world, Iraq and Syria, have crumbled. So basically, the idea of the nation state crumbling in that part of the world, and a militant Islamist group controlling land and positioning itself as a real state. That is the real danger. And in my opinion, by the way, that's why in this country that you are interviewing me in, Lebanon, it becomes extremely important to preserve and protect and sustain the nation state, because it's crucial amidst the fall of the other states that has been in this part of the world.
Let's end on that, since you mentioned Lebanon. Lebanon in the last 4 years alone, we were calculating the other day, saw 25 bombings. There are major internal conflicts, but also a lot of external influences that affect
on the country,
the state of the country. But in terms of Syria, and in terms of ISIS, and in terms of the coexistence that we were talking about of different religions and different sects in this country, what do you think the future looks like? You said that Lebanon has to stay stable, or is it in its interest to stay stable? However, it's shaky grounds constantly, a bit like now.
Well, one, it's not just in Lebanon's interest to stay stable. I think it's in the interest of the entire region for Lebanon to stay stable.
Why?
Oh, Lebanon has two extremely important notions attached to it. One, despite the fact that the political system in Lebanon is divided according to certain posts for certain sects, the idea of the founding fathers of Lebanon, whether Riyad al-Sulh or Bashar al-Khoury or others, was that you will at one point in time, the idea of Lebanon is to transcend actually sectarianism, to have a secular, liberal Arab nation in this part of the world. If that idea fails, I think you have immense problems.
Do you think they succeeded a little bit up till now?
In the beginning, absolutely, of course. And you can also argue that in the 1990s, after the end of the Civil War, there was a resuscitation of that idea. But the second extremely important thing about Lebanon in particular is the Muslim Arabs. This country has always been a major concentration of Arab Christians. And keep in mind that Arab Christians, in addition to their incredibly important contribution to the culture, politics, art of the Arab world in the last century, they also make a huge distinction between Arabism, Arabness, versus Islam or Islamism.
Right.
And it's crucial to the Arab identity. So this country is crucially important. Its sustainability is of immense importance to all of us, not just the Lebanese.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a recap of our top stories. Turkey readies for its first cross-party rally to condemn the bloody coup attempt against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. At least 14 people are killed in Iraq as a bomber blows himself up at a police checkpoint in Baghdad's district of Kadhimiya. And Syrian government airstrikes hit 4 hospitals in Baghdad. Syrian government airstrikes hit 4 hospitals and a local blood bank in Syria's Aleppo. Excuses for the mistake. Those are your top stories here from us here at Future Television for this Sunday. I'm Linda Tamima. Thank you all for watching.